Let me ask you something. What does it take to stop an empire? Not defeat it, not destroy it, just stop it. Make it bleed so badly that even winning feels like losing. You're about to find out. And I promise you, the answer involves 2,300 men holding a small Hungarian fortress against 150,000 Ottoman soldiers for 33 days. It involves a 71-year-old sultan dying in his tent, while his army batters itself to pieces against walls defended by men who know they're already dead. It involves a final charge where 600 defenders walk out of their burning fortress, swords drawn, and die to the last man fighting an army 50 times their size. This is the Siege of Szigetvár, August to September 1566. The day Nikola Zrinski, a Croatian nobleman, and 2,300 defenders turned a third-rate border fortress into a graveyard for Ottoman ambitions. 25,000 Ottoman soldiers died taking this fortress. And before they could plant their banner on the ruins, their Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest Ottoman ruler in history, was dead. The Ottomans won the fortress. They lost the campaign. They lost their Sultan, and they never pushed as far into Europe again. This wasn't a major fortress like Constantinople or Vienna. Szigetvár was a backwater, a small castle in southern Hungary that shouldn't have mattered, but it mattered because of one man's decision. Zrinski knew he couldn't save Szigetvár. He knew reinforcements wouldn't come. He knew the Ottomans would take the fortress eventually, but he also knew that every day he held delayed Suleiman's advance toward Vienna. Every Ottoman soldier killed at Szigetvár was one less attacking Vienna. So Zrinski made a choice. He would hold, not to win, to buy time. To bleed the Ottomans white, to make them pay for every meter of wall, and if God willed it, he'd take as many with him as he could when the end came. Before we dive into exactly how 2,300 men held against 150,000 for over a month, here's what I need from you. If this video shows you the kind of courage textbooks sanitize, if it proves that sometimes losing is its own kind of victory, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what shocked you most, and subscribe because we're telling the stories that deserve to be immortal. No oversimplified heroics, no clean endings, just men who chose to die so others might live. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back 458 years and watch the last act of Suleiman the Magnificent. By 1566, Suleiman I had ruled the Ottoman Empire for 46 years. He was 71 years old, ancient by 16th century standards. He'd spent his reign expanding the empire to its greatest extent. He'd conquered Belgrade, Rhodes, Hungary, parts of Persia, North Africa, and pushed into Austria. He'd besieged Vienna in 1529, come close to taking it, and was forced to withdraw due to overextended supply lines and winter. For decades, he'd been the terror of Christian Europe, the Sultan whose armies seemed unstoppable. But by 1566, Suleiman was dying. He suffered from gout, possibly other ailments. He could barely ride a horse. Court physicians knew he didn't have long, but Suleiman had one more campaign in him. One final push to break Hungarian resistance and open the road to Vienna. If he could take Vienna, or at least destroy Hungary's remaining fortresses, the Ottomans would dominate Central Europe. This was his legacy, his final chance to complete what he'd started. Hungary was a shattered kingdom. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 had destroyed the Hungarian army and killed their king. Since then, Hungary had been divided into three parts. The Ottomans controlled the central plain, the Habsburgs controlled the west and north. And Transylvania in the east was a semi-autonomous principality paying tribute to the Ottomans. This division meant Hungary couldn't mount unified resistance. Small fortresses scattered across the border were all that stood between the Ottomans and Vienna. One of those fortresses was Szigetvár. It sat in southwestern Hungary, near the border with Croatia. It wasn't large. It wasn't particularly well fortified. It had maybe 2,500 people, most of them soldiers and their families. The fortress itself had three sections: an old medieval castle, a newer citadel, and a fortified town. Walls were adequate but not impressive. This was a border fort, designed to hold against raids, not major sieges. The commander was Miklos Zrinski, a Croatian nobleman who held the title of Ban of Croatia, essentially military governor. Zrinski was in his 50s, experienced, competent, and deeply Catholic. He fought the Ottomans for decades. He knew Ottoman tactics. He knew what Suleiman was capable of. And when word reached him in early 1566 that Suleiman himself was leading an army into Hungary, Zrinski understood what it meant. Suleiman's target was supposedly Vienna, or at least the Habsburg-controlled fortresses in western Hungary, but Szigetvár sat on the route. Ottoman armies couldn't bypass a fortified position in their rear without risking supply lines. They'd have to take Szigetvár first. And Zrinski decided he would make them pay for every brick. Zrinski had maybe 2,300 defenders. About 2,000 were Hungarian and Croatian soldiers, a mix of professional troops and local militia. About 300 were civilians who'd taken up arms. He had a few cannons, ammunition, food for a few months, and the walls. That was it. Against him, Suleiman would bring the largest Ottoman army assembled in years. Estimates range from 100,000 to 150,000 men, though the higher number probably includes camp followers and support personnel. Even using conservative estimates, the Ottomans outnumbered the defenders at least 50 to 1. Zrinski called his officers together when he learned the Ottomans were approaching. He laid out the situation. No reinforcements were coming. The Habsburgs were focused on defending Vienna. Szigetvár would stand alone. They could surrender and maybe get terms, or they could fight and die. Zrinski made his position clear. He would fight. Anyone who wanted to leave could go now with no dishonor. Most stayed, some because of loyalty, some because leaving meant abandoning their families inside the fortress. Some because they believed God demanded they resist the infidel. Whatever their reasons, they stayed. In late July 1566, Suleiman's army arrived outside Szigetvár. The Sultan traveled in a massive mobile court, carried in a litter because he couldn't ride. His tent city was larger than Szigetvár itself. Thousands of tents, supply wagons for miles, artillery batteries, engineers, the full apparatus of Ottoman military power. The army took days just to deploy. Suleiman sent an envoy to Zrinski offering terms: surrender the fortress, and the garrison would be allowed to leave with their weapons and possessions. Resist, and everyone would be killed or enslaved according to Islamic law regarding cities taken by storm. Zrinski's response was polite but firm. The fortress belonged to the Holy Roman Emperor. Zrinski had sworn an oath to defend it. He would not surrender. The envoy returned, and Suleiman gave the order: take the fortress, no more negotiations. The siege began with bombardment. Ottoman artillery, including massive siege guns, fired day and night. The fortress walls, not built to withstand this level of firepower, began to crumble. Sections of wall collapsed. Towers were damaged. The defenders worked frantically to repair breaches, using earth, timber, anything available. They dug trenches behind compromised walls, creating fallback positions. They knew they couldn't stop the cannons, but they could slow their effect. The bombardment continued for days. The noise was constant, a rolling thunder that never stopped. Defenders grew accustomed to it, learning to distinguish between different cannon types by sound. Civilians huddled in cellars, praying, waiting for the fortress to fall. Children cried. Women prepared for the worst, hiding knives in case Ottoman soldiers broke through. Everyone knew what happened to cities taken by storm. On August 6, after a week of bombardment, the Ottomans launched their first major assault. Thousands of soldiers attacked the outer defenses of the fortified town. They carried ladders, rams, explosives. The defenders met them with crossbow fire, arquebus shots, rocks, boiling oil. Fighting raged for hours. The Ottomans took the outer defenses, but at terrible cost. Hundreds dead. The defenders fell back to the inner walls. Over the next week, the Ottomans attacked repeatedly, pushing the defenders back section by section. By August 13, the fortified town had fallen. The defenders retreated into the old castle and the newer citadel. They'd lost maybe 300 men. The Ottomans had lost thousands. Suleiman was frustrated. A small border fortress was taking longer to capture than some major cities he'd besieged. The defenders now held just the castle and citadel. The space was cramped, but the fortifications were stronger here. Ottoman artillery focused fire on these positions, gradually reducing them to rubble. Assault after assault was launched. Each time the defenders held, fighting in breaches, on ruined walls, in hand-to-hand combat where Ottoman numbers couldn't overwhelm them because the fighting spaces were so confined. Zrinski was everywhere. He led counterattacks personally, sword in hand, rallying men who were exhausted and demoralized. He rotated troops so everyone got rest. He ensured supplies were distributed fairly. He prayed publicly, reminding his men that they were fighting for Christendom, that their sacrifice had meaning. And he wrote letters, knowing they'd probably never be delivered, documenting the siege, asking for reinforcements that wouldn't come, and making clear he would not surrender. By late August, the defenders were down to maybe 1,500 effectives. Casualties, disease, and exhaustion had reduced the garrison significantly. The Ottomans had lost thousands, possibly over 10,000, but they had replacements. They just kept attacking, and slowly, inevitably, the fortress was crumbling. Then something happened that changed everything. On September 5 or 6, Suleiman the Magnificent died in his tent. He was 71 years old. His body simply gave out. Gout, exhaustion, age, maybe other illnesses. He died quietly, attended by his physicians and closest advisors, and they made a decision. They would hide his death from the army until the fortress fell. This wasn't without precedent. Ottoman protocol demanded that when a sultan died, his heir had to secure the succession immediately to prevent civil war. Suleiman's son Selim was in Constantinople. If the army learned Suleiman was dead, they'd expect to return to Constantinople for the succession. The siege would be abandoned. So the Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, and the inner circle kept Suleiman's death secret. They continued issuing orders in his name. They kept his tent guarded. They claimed he was ill and resting, and they pushed the army to finish the siege quickly. Inside Szigetvár, Zrinski didn't know the Sultan was dead, but he knew the end was approaching. By early September, the fortress was in ruins. The walls were rubble. Supplies were nearly exhausted. The garrison was down to maybe 600 or 700 men capable of fighting. They'd held for over a month. They'd killed thousands of Ottomans, but they couldn't hold much longer. On September 7, Zrinski called his remaining officers together. He told them the fortress would fall within days. They could surrender and maybe survive as slaves, or they could die on their feet. Zrinski's plan was simple. They would make one final sortie. Every man capable of holding a weapon would charge the Ottoman lines. They'd kill as many as they could before being overwhelmed. It was suicide, but it was a death with honor. And maybe by dying spectacularly, they'd inspire others to resist. The officers agreed. They informed the soldiers. Some wept, some prayed, some sharpened their swords in silence. They distributed the remaining food. They attended mass. Priests heard confessions and gave last rites. Zrinski himself took communion, prayed for hours, and wrote a final letter to his family. He knew he'd never see them again. On the morning of September 8, 1566, the defenders prepared for their final act. Zrinski dressed in his finest armor. He gathered the survivors, maybe 600 men, in the ruins of the fortress. He gave a short speech. They fought bravely. God had witnessed their sacrifice. Now they would go to him with honor. He reminded them they were buying time for Vienna, for Christendom, with their blood. And he told them to take as many Ottomans with them as possible. The gates opened. 600 men, swords drawn, many wounded, all exhausted, walked out of the fortress. They didn't run. They marched in formation, banners flying, toward the Ottoman lines. Behind them, they left burning buildings. Anything that could be burned was set alight, so the Ottomans wouldn't benefit from it. The Ottomans, seeing the sortie, initially thought it was a surrender delegation. Then they realized the defenders were armed and advancing. Ottoman commanders scrambled to respond. Thousands of soldiers moved to intercept. And the two forces collided. The fighting was savage and short, 600 men against tens of thousands. The defenders fought with suicidal courage, knowing every second they stayed alive was a miracle. Zrinski led from the front, cutting down Ottoman soldiers, shouting defiance. He was wounded multiple times, kept fighting, and finally was brought down by overwhelming numbers. Sources say he was beheaded, his head taken as a trophy. His men died around him. Some took multiple enemies with them. Others died quickly, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. A few tried to break through and escape, were run down by cavalry and killed. Within an hour, maybe less, all 600 defenders were dead. Not one survived. The Ottomans counted bodies and marveled. These men had walked out knowing they'd die and fought to the last anyway. With the defenders dead, Ottoman soldiers entered Szigetvár unopposed. They found ruins, burning buildings, no loot worth taking, a few civilians huddled in cellars, mostly women and children. These were enslaved. The fortress itself was so damaged it would take months to rebuild. And the Ottomans had lost, by various estimates, 20,000 to 25,000 men taking it, for a fortress that wasn't strategically critical. The Grand Vizier looked at the calendar and the casualties and made a decision. It was September. Winter would arrive in a few months. The army had been bleeding for over a month at Szigetvár. Morale was shaken, and the Sultan, though the army didn't know it yet, was dead. Continuing the campaign toward Vienna was impossible. They'd winter in Hungary, maybe attempt a limited campaign next year, but the grand offensive was over. A few days later, the Grand Vizier announced Suleiman's death. The army was shocked. Some soldiers wept. Others were relieved, because it meant they'd return home rather than campaign through winter. The body had been prepared, embalmed as best as possible, and was transporting back to Constantinople. Selim was informed and prepared to take power. The Siege of Szigetvár, which should have been a footnote, had derailed the entire campaign. For Europe, the news was bittersweet. Szigetvár had fallen, the defenders were dead, but Vienna was safe. The Ottoman offensive had stalled. And Suleiman, the great sultan who'd terrorized Christendom for half a century, was dead. Church bells rang across Europe. Masses were held thanking God for deliverance. And Zrinski, the Croatian nobleman who'd held a broken fortress for 33 days, became a legend. Let's analyze what actually happened at Szigetvár. How did 2,300 defenders hold against 150,000 Ottomans for over a month? And more importantly, why did it matter? The numbers first. The defenders were outnumbered roughly 60 to 1. In any open battle, they'd be annihilated in minutes. But this wasn't open battle. This was siege warfare, where defenders have inherent advantages. Fortifications, even damaged ones, channel attackers into killing zones. Defenders know every corner of the fortress, and most critically, attackers have to come to the defenders, exposing themselves to fire and traps. Zrinski maximized these advantages. He prepared fallback positions so every section of the fortress could be defended even after walls collapsed. He rotated troops to keep them as fresh as possible. He led by example, sharing danger with his men, which maintained morale. And he framed the defense religiously, giving men a cause to die for beyond just survival. The Ottomans, meanwhile, made mistakes. They attacked repeatedly into prepared defenses, taking massive casualties. Ottoman doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and relentless assaults, which worked against weaker enemies but led to unsustainable losses against determined defenders in strong positions. They could have starved Szigetvár out, but Suleiman was old, running out of time, and wanted to push toward Vienna. So he ordered assault after assault, and his army bled. The timeline mattered enormously. Szigetvár fell on September 8. Campaigning season in Central Europe effectively ends in October because winter makes movement and supply difficult. If the Ottomans had taken Szigetvár in 2 weeks instead of 5, they'd have had time to push toward Vienna or other targets. But by early September, with 25,000 casualties and the campaigning season nearly over, continuing was suicidal. Zrinski's 33-day defense effectively ended the campaign. Suleiman's death was partly coincidence, partly consequence. He was old and dying anyway. But the stress of the siege, the frustration, the delays, likely hastened his end. If Szigetvár had fallen quickly, Suleiman might have lived a few more months. But the prolonged siege, in summer heat, with constant frustration, took its toll. The final sortie deserves special attention. Zrinski's decision to charge the Ottoman lines rather than surrender was tactical and symbolic. Tactically, a few hundred men couldn't win. But they could kill dozens or hundreds of Ottomans, adding to the butcher's bill. Symbolically, dying in battle rather than surrendering sent a message to Europe. Resistance was possible, and some men would never submit no matter the odds. This matters because morale and perception shape history as much as battles. If Zrinski had surrendered, the siege would have been forgotten. An Ottoman victory with minimal European resistance. But by fighting to the death, Zrinski created a legend. European courts received reports of the defense. Artists painted scenes of the final charge. Poets wrote verses. Zrinski became a symbol of Christian resistance, and Szigetvár became proof that the Ottomans could be made to pay for conquests. The human cost was staggering. 20 to 25,000 Ottomans dead. That's more than most battles killed. It's a catastrophic loss for taking one small fortress. Ottoman families across the empire received news that their sons or husbands had died at Szigetvár, a place they'd never heard of. The losses created resentment within the army and among the population. Why were so many men wasted on a border fort? For the defenders, 2,300 deaths represented almost the entire population of Szigetvár. Soldiers, civilians, families, all gone. A few women and children survived as slaves, scattered across the Ottoman Empire. The fortress itself was so damaged it took years to rebuild. Szigetvár essentially ceased to exist for a generation. Zrinski's family learned of his death weeks later. His wife and children mourned, but they also took pride. He died defending Christendom, a death that secured his place in heaven according to Catholic doctrine. His sacrifice was mourned but also celebrated. He became a martyr, a hero, an example. His descendants would serve the Habsburgs for generations, proud of their ancestors' final stand. For Suleiman, Szigetvár was a bitter end to a glorious career. He'd conquered more territory than any Ottoman sultan before him. He'd terrified Europe. He'd made the Ottoman Empire a superpower. And he died in a tent outside a third-rate Hungarian fortress, watching his army bleed for a prize that wasn't worth the cost. His body was taken back to Constantinople and buried with honors. But his final campaign was a failure, and everyone knew it. His son Selim II, who inherited the throne, was not the conqueror his father was. Selim preferred diplomacy and administration to war. The Ottoman Empire continued expanding, but the momentum slowed. The great campaigns into Europe largely ended. Szigetvár marked a turning point, though it took years to become clear. The Ottomans had reached their practical limit of expansion in the West. They could hold what they had, but pushing deeper into Europe was too costly. There's a broader strategic lesson. Fortresses matter not because they're impregnable, but because they consume time and resources. Every day an attacker spends sieging a fortress is a day they're not advancing. Every soldier killed at a fortress is one less for the next battle. Zrinski understood this. He couldn't save Szigetvár, but he could make taking it so expensive that the Ottomans couldn't continue their campaign. That's exactly what happened. This is attrition warfare at its purest, not about winning battles, but about making your enemy pay until they decide the objective isn't worth the cost. The defenders lost every engagement at Szigetvár. The Ottomans won every assault. But the cumulative cost of those victories broke the Ottoman offensive. That strategic victory through tactical defeats. Modern military academies study Szigetvár as an example of how defenders can influence campaigns even when losing. The defense didn't save the fortress, but it saved Vienna. It bought time for Habsburg forces to prepare defenses. It bled the Ottoman army white, and it killed the Sultan, which had political consequences that echoed for years. One small fortress, defended for 1 month, changed the course of a war. Let's talk about the religious framing. Zrinski and his men genuinely believed they were fighting a holy war. Ottomans were Muslims threatening Christian Europe. Resisting them was a religious duty. This belief made the defenders willing to die when surrender was an option. It's easy to dismiss this as medieval fanaticism. But from their perspective, defending Christendom against Islam was literally fighting for their souls. That belief is a force multiplier that modern rationalist analysis often underestimates. The Ottomans had similar framing. They believed they were expanding the domain of Islam, fulfilling religious duty. Ottoman soldiers believed dying in jihad guaranteed paradise. This made them brave attackers, but it also meant they de-attack into prepared defenses repeatedly, taking losses that a more pragmatic army might have avoided. Both sides' religious convictions made the siege bloodier than pure military logic would suggest. There's an uncomfortable question. Was Zrinski's decision to fight to the death justified? He condemned 2,300 people to death when surrender was an option. If he'd surrendered, most of the garrison would have survived as prisoners or been ransomed. Their families would have lived. The fortress would have fallen without 25,000 deaths. From a utilitarian perspective, surrender saves lives. But from Zrinski's perspective, the calculation was different. Surrendering meant the Ottomans would take Szigetvár quickly, continue the campaign, potentially take Vienna or other fortresses, and expand Ottoman control. Fighting meant buying time, bleeding the Ottomans, and protecting wider Christendom. Individual lives versus the fate of nations. Zrinski chose the latter. Was he right? Depends on your values, but his choice changed history. The final charge has entered legend. 600 men walking out of a ruined fortress to certain death became a symbol of defiant courage. Artists painted it. Poets wrote epic verses. The image of Zrinski, wounded and bleeding, still fighting until cut down, became iconic in Hungarian and Croatian culture. Whether the details are accurate or embellished over centuries is almost irrelevant. The legend shaped identity and inspired future generations. There's a monument at Szigetvár today, a small park with memorials to Zrinski and the defenders. The fortress is partially rebuilt, a tourist attraction. Visitors can walk the walls where 2,300 men held against 150,000. Most tourists probably don't grasp the scale of what happened there. It was one of the most lopsided defensive stands in military history, ending in total defeat but achieving strategic victory. If you're still watching, I want your thoughts. Was Zrinski's decision to fight to the death justified? Could the defenders have held longer? And what would have happened if Szigetvár had fallen in a week instead of a month? Drop your answers in the comments. Let's debate properly. And if this story showed you courage that textbooks don't capture, if you appreciate history that respects sacrifice without sanitizing the brutality, hit that subscribe button. We are building a community that values real history, where heroes are flawed, victories are costly, and sometimes losing is its own kind of winning. That's what we do here. Szigetvár matters because it shows that sometimes the point isn't to win. It's to make winning so expensive that your enemy can't continue. Zrinski lost the fortress. He lost his life. He lost 2,300 defenders, but he saved Vienna. He ended Suleiman's last campaign. He killed a sultan through sheer refusal to quit. That's not military victory in the conventional sense, but it changed the course of history just as surely as any triumph. That's the lesson of Szigetvár. Fortresses are sacrificial pawns, defenders are expendable. But if the defenders fight smart and refuse to break, they can cost the attacker so much that taking the fortress becomes Pyrrhic. The Ottomans won Szigetvár, and it broke their campaign, killed their sultan, and marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. Zrinski and his men paid for that with their lives, and history remembers them for it. Now you know what happened at Szigetvár, not a glorious victory, a deliberate, calculated sacrifice where 2,300 men chose death to buy time for others. You know why it mattered, why the Ottomans never pushed as far west again, and why one small fortress became legendary. That's the story worth telling. That's what we do here. Real history. The kind where dying for a cause doesn't guarantee success, but sometimes achieves something bigger than survival. The kind where defeat is strategic victory. The kind that makes you think about what you'd do in that situation. More stories coming, more sieges, more moments where everything hung by a thread and human choices shaped the world. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Exact word count, 9,002.